Have you ever wondered if the image we have of Jesus is truly true? Most of us grew up hearing that he was poor, without possessions, almost a wanderer. But what if I told you that there are biblical and historical facts that reveal another side, ignored for centuries? A side that few have the courage to explore, for fear of breaking religious paradigms. This isn't just a question of theological curiosity. It's about understanding the spiritual financial freedom Jesus possessed and its impact on how he dealt with money, people, and his own purpose. In this study, we'll delve deep into the behind-the-scenes details of his life. Get ready. The truth about Jesus can change the way you view wealth, poverty, and even your own journey. For centuries, Jesus was portrayed as an extremely poor man, almost a beggar, wandering the streets in rags and dependent on the charity of others. This image gained traction with artistic representations of the Middle Ages and ecclesiastical discourses that extolled the total renunciation of material goods. But is this image faithful to the historical Jesus, or was it molded to reinforce an ideal of absolute sacrifice? The truth, which few acknowledge, is that this version was largely constructed with symbolic intentions, not based on solid evidence. The idea of a miserable Jesus contributed to the creation of a spiritual standard in which poverty and holiness go hand in hand. This created a profound myth that still affects the way many view the relationship between faith and prosperity. After all, if Jesus was poor, then would the pursuit of spiritual financial freedom be reprehensible? This kind of thinking still traps many people in a cycle of scarcity and guilt. But is this really what the Bible and Jesus himself teach? Contradictions begin to emerge when we look more closely at the sacred texts. The seamless tunic, which the soldiers fought over at the foot of the cross, was a rare and valuable item. The Magi's gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, were not merely symbolic, they were items of real value. Details like these, often overlooked, point to an economic reality different from the one romanticized over the centuries. Of course, Jesus lived simply, but simplicity is not synonymous with poverty. Jesus' poverty, in this sense, seems to have been more of a strategic choice than an imposed condition. He spoke with kings and priests, was welcomed by influential families, and yet walked among the marginalized. Jesus' wealth was not found in coffers, but neither was it limited to a life of scarcity. What we need to begin to realize is that the traditional image of a Jesus stripped to the bone perhaps says more about its creator than about Christ himself. By accepting this construct without question, we risk ignoring a powerful dimension of his mission: to show that true spiritual financial freedom depends not on the amount of money in one's pocket, but on the place money occupies in one's heart. Speaking of wealth or poverty in first-century Galilee requires caution. The concept of poor at that time is not the same as we use today. Back then, being poor could mean anything from living with the bare necessities to being marginalized by the social and religious system. Wealth, however, wasn't just about money, but also about status, access to land, family ties, and proximity to power. To understand Jesus' true situation, we need to look at this broader economic and cultural context, not at modern labels. Galilee was an economically active region with important trade routes and the presence of cities like Sepphoris and Tiberias, which concentrated elites, artisans, and soldiers. It was not an isolated and impoverished village, as many imagine. Families with a trade, like Joseph, Jesus' father, generally earned a stable living. The famous carpenter was likely a tekton, a builder, someone who worked with wood, stone, and even structural projects. This indicates a respectable level of skill and a solid professional position in local society. Furthermore, the Jewish family structure was very different from ours. The family functioned as a micro-enterprise and a support network. Children learned their father's trade, women managed the household, and there was a sense of economic interdependence. This means that Jesus' family was neither destitute nor isolated. They participated in public life, traveled to religious festivals, and maintained a relatively active social life. All of this points to a more balanced economic situation than the image of extreme poverty that was later disseminated. Another important point is that Jesus lived in a time when the economy was deeply marked by Roman fiscal oppression. Taxes were heavy, unfair, and generated social outrage. This reality is reflected in Jesus' words about money, such as, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's," which demonstrate a critical yet practical awareness of how to navigate within this system. He was neither naive nor economically alienated. His message of spiritual financial freedom emerged as a counterpoint to the oppression of the time. Understanding this scenario changes everything. It helps deconstruct the myths about Jesus and money and reveals a man who knew the system, moved between social classes, and was never dominated by money, but also never held hostage by scarcity. With this clearer background, we can move forward to look more closely at Jesus' family and understand how all this translated into practice. The image of Joseph as a simple carpenter does not do justice to the original term used in biblical texts, tekton. At the time, a tekton was much more than someone who simply sawed wood. He was a versatile professional, a builder who mastered structural techniques, design, and even rudimentary engineering. This places Joseph, and by extension, Jesus' family, in a position of relative financial stability, especially considering that he worked near growing urban centers like Sepphoris, a city neighboring Nazareth. The mobility of Jesus' family is also indicative of their condition. They traveled, and it was costly. Compare, for example, with the poorest families of the time, who rarely traveled beyond their own village. Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem, Egypt, returned to Nazareth, and went to Jerusalem for religious festivals such as Passover. These trips required resources and planning. Even though they were not wealthy, they lived with a geographic and economic freedom that many did not have. Furthermore, religious festivals in Jerusalem involved expenses for lodging, food, and offerings at the temple. This was no casual tourism. The presence of Jesus' family at these events demonstrates not only an active faith, but also a family structure that was able to maintain these commitments. What's more, all this took place within an environment that, although dominated by Rome, still granted a certain degree of autonomy to practicing Jews who managed to organize themselves economically. It's also worth remembering that culturally, a family's honor was tied to its reputation and its ability to provide. Joseph, as head of the family, taught Jesus his trade, and this ensured professional continuity and dignity. Jesus' poverty, if it existed, was a choice within a context in which he could have lived more comfortably, but he preferred to walk among the humble without being a prisoner of money. What we see, therefore, is a structured, hard-working family with religious, social, and even political ties. Some scholars mention kinship with members of the priesthood. All of this dispels the idea that Jesus came from absolute poverty. On the contrary, reality points to an environment of balance, effort, and purpose, and this paves the way for us to delve into an often overlooked detail: Jesus' clothing, gifts, and connections. One of the most curious and often overlooked details about Jesus is his seamless tunic. This type of garment was considered fine, rare, and expensive. It was made of a single piece of fabric, usually hand-woven, seamlessly from top to bottom. When the Roman soldiers saw this tunic during the crucifixion, they decided not to tear it, but cast lots to see who would keep it. This is not just a narrative detail, it is a direct sign that Jesus wore, at least on important occasions, clothing of significant value. Another powerful and symbolic point is the gifts of the Magi: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Many people treat these as part of the nativity scene decorations, but these items had great commercial value. The gold needs no explanation. The frankincense was used in sacred rituals and as a luxury item, The myrrh was used in perfumes, medicines, and embalming, all highly valuable. This raises a question: what happened to these gifts? Some scholars suggest they served to finance the flight from Egypt and the early years of Jesus' life. In other words, Jesus' wealth was present from the cradle, but it's not just objects we're talking about. Jesus' social relationships also reveal connections with influential people. He conversed with Pharisees, teachers of the law, Roman centurions, and even members of the elite, such as Joseph of Arimathea, who offered his own tomb for Christ's burial. This shows that Jesus was not isolated from the highest social circles. He moved among all strata, remaining accessible to the poor, but also present among the powerful. There's also the financial support he received throughout his ministry. Women like Joanna, wife of Chusa, Herod's administrator, and other disciples mentioned in Luke 8, financed the group's travel and needs. This dismantles the myth of Jesus as totally dependent on miracles to survive. There was structure, there was planning, there was provision. Jesus' poverty once again appears to be a conscious lifestyle choice, not an imposition of circumstances. These elements, costly clothing, noble gifts, strategic relationships, and financial support, shed new light on the historical Jesus. He didn't live surrounded by luxury, but he also didn't reject the resources that came his way. What's more, he used everything wisely. This brings us to the next fundamental point. What was Jesus's true attitude toward money? One of the biggest myths about Jesus is that he condemned money. But just look closely at the biblical context to realize that Christ's message was never against wealth itself, but rather against its idolatry. When he said, "You cannot serve God and mammon," he wasn't telling you to live in poverty, but warning about the risk of money taking the place of God in your heart. The spiritual financial freedom that Jesus taught began within, in the awareness of who is in charge of whom. Consider the famous quote, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven." This statement shocked the disciples, who immediately asked, "Then who can be saved?" This shows that, in that culture, wealth was seen as a sign of blessing. Jesus didn't deny this. He simply taught that when a person clings to money as their security, they lose the essence of the kingdom, which is living by faith, not possession. The problem was never having, but being dominated by what one has. Another direct example is Jesus' response to the question about taxes. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. He didn't shy away from the economic system of his time. On the contrary, he demonstrated practical wisdom and balance. This response reveals someone who deeply understood how the economy worked and knew how to position himself discerningly. Jesus and money in this context weren't enemies. They were allies when placed in the right order. Furthermore, Jesus frequently spoke about financial principles in his parables: lost coins, multiplied talents, faithful stewards. In Luke 16, for example, he praises the shrewdness of the manager who used his resources strategically. This shows us that Jesus valued the wise use of money as long as it was in the service of something greater, the kingdom of God. He didn't promote misery, he promoted purpose. Understanding this attitude changes everything. It shows that Jesus' poverty was not a mandatory model, but a sign of his mission. And at the same time, it challenges us not to make money our master. Jesus was rich in wisdom, connection with the Father, and a vision of the kingdom, and he invited everyone to access this wealth, without guilt, without fear, without slavery. And this leads us to an essential question. How did Jesus sustain his ministry for 3 years without a fixed income, but without lacking anything? It's impressive how Jesus' ministry lasted about 3 years, with constant travel, food, lodging, and a group of disciples at his side, all without mention of any financial crisis or lack of resources. This didn't happen by chance. There was indeed a strategy. Jesus didn't live improvised. Jesus' financial support came from a network of people committed to the mission, many of them influential, such as noble women and wealthy men. Luke 8:2-3 makes this clear. Women like Joanna, Chuza's wife, Susanna, and many others helped with their own resources. Joanna was the wife of Herod's steward, that is, someone high up in the ranks. This shows that Jesus' ministry received intentional investment. There was resource management, so much so that the group even had a treasurer, Judas Iscariot. And having someone responsible for the money is a clear sign of organization. This wasn't a group of unruly wanderers, but a movement with logistics. Hospitality was also key. Jesus stayed in the homes of friends, disciples, and supporters, such as Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. In these homes, besides resting, he taught, ate, and strengthened bonds. This support network was a model of community economics, where resources circulated to fulfill a purpose. This reveals a powerful principle. Jesus' poverty did not impede the advancement of his mission because he knew how to strategically connect people and resources. Another interesting point is that even with available resources, Jesus never hoarded. He was supplied for each day, and this reflected his trust in the Father. "Give us this day our daily bread" was more than a prayer. It was a lifestyle. He taught about contentment, but also about multiplication. He fed multitudes with little, not by magic, but by faith and generosity. The miracle came after sharing, and this too is resource management from a spiritual perspective. Thus, Jesus' ministry shows that it is possible to live purposefully without scarcity, even without a traditional income. It is an invitation to rethink what we call financial security. Indeed, what Jesus experienced was a spiritual financial freedom based on continuous supply and trust. And all of this prepares us to reflect on the question many ask, but few answer in depth. After all, was Jesus rich or poor? We come to the question that drives so many discussions. Was Jesus rich or poor? The answer, in fact, goes beyond these categories. He wasn't a millionaire surrounded by gold, but he's also far from the image of an abandoned wretch. What we see, looking carefully at the historical Jesus, is someone who made conscious choices. He had access to resources, connections, financial support, but he wasn't attached to anything. He was provided for, not submissive to money, and that completely changes the conversation. Throughout the Gospels, it becomes clear that Jesus lived with purpose, not scarcity. Jesus' poverty was strategic. It allowed him to mingle with the marginalized, live freely, and demonstrate that abundant life lies not in possessions, but in mission. And yet, he never lacked the necessities. Jesus' wealth was not in earthly treasures, but in his ability to manifest the kingdom with resources that came at the right time, from the right hands. This stance is profoundly liberating because Jesus didn't condemn those who had money. He confronted those who were enslaved by it. When speaking to the rich young man, for example, it wasn't money that was the problem, but the heart attached to it. Jesus and money weren't enemies. They were part of a dialogue about purpose, priorities, and values. This is the truth few share. Jesus didn't come to teach us how to be poor. He came to teach us how to be free. And being free involves understanding that money can be a tool for spiritual expansion or a prison for the soul. The Bible and money are constantly intertwined. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Gospels, they all speak of how to manage resources wisely. Jesus didn't live for status, but for mission. And when the mission is clear, resources flow. Jesus was simple, not miserly, and that makes all the difference. Jesus' true wealth was invisible to the eye, but transformative for those who approached him. He carried an abundance that was measured not by coins, but by impact. And it is this abundance that he offered to everyone: inner freedom, eternal purpose, and a new way of seeing the value of life. The question now is no longer whether Jesus was rich or poor. The question is, what is his true wealth? By now, You may have realized that the question, was Jesus rich or poor, goes far beyond numbers. It's a provocation that leads us to reflect on our own beliefs, our attachments, and what we truly seek. Have you let the myth of scarcity hinder your steps? Or have you understood that true spiritual financial freedom begins within you? Think about it. How have you been handling money? Is it a servant to your benefit or a master controlling your feelings? Jesus' example reveals that it is possible to live with purpose, dignity, and resources without losing your heart. How about using what you have today to bless more people and build something that goes beyond material things? Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: it's not about having a lot or a little, but about being clear about why. Jesus used what came into his hands to transform, heal, teach, and nourish. You can do the same with the gifts and resources you have, even if they seem small, because true prosperity is that which touches the world around you. And if this video resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share, comment, and tell us what most inspired you about this study. And of course, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and follow other topics that will challenge your mind, strengthen your faith, and transform your perspective on wealth, purpose, and spirituality.